Chapter 4 The Morning, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu huddled on his pallet and stared miserably at the tightly shut door across from him. He didn't know what he'd done wrong, but clearly there had been something. Lord Antony had had a cot set up right next to his own bed, obviously prepared for a good offering, one who deserved such proximity to the god, one who might be called upon for intimate service, one like a sow. But then he had deemed Hanyu unworthy and ordered him to move the pallet to the sitting room. It had been going so well, too, at least as far as Hanyu could tell. Lord Antony had called him pet, and been so very kind, bandaging his wounds and even worrying about whether he'd hurt Hanyu when he drank from him. It hadn't hurt exactly, or at least it hadn't only hurt. There had been a good deal of pain when the god's teeth pierced his skin, but that had been ameliorated by the heady thrill of feeling Lord Antony's lips pressed to his neck, and after that there had been a curious burning that reminded him of the sensation of swallowing slightly too much rum in one swig. But it wasn't really unpleasant, especially not when it was combined with the dizzying sensation of the god's hand in his hair and body pressed close to his. The restrained power he'd felt in that one slender hand had been incredible. Truly, the strength of the gods was overwhelming, and Hanyu had been more than happy to be overwhelmed. And afterwards, when Lord Antony had licked his neck before bandaging it, Hanyu's thoughts broke off into an ecstatic shudder at the memory of that slow, cool swipe of tongue, and he felt his cock twitch against his leg. At that moment, he had thought for sure he was about to be granted the honor of the god's bed. Hanyu had been awestruck when he realized that the god's body was cold. There was no mistaking his touch for that of a mortal. And, as he thought more about it, Hanyu realized something dizzying and wonderful. He now knew more about Lord Antony than even the high priest. That old windbag wouldn't even be able to imagine the ecstasy of sharp fangs and a cool tongue. Hanyu had been rock hard under his robe, imagining what other wonderful mysteries he might be made privy to that night. Instead, he'd been banished to the sitting room. No matter how many times Hanyu thought things over, he couldn't tell where he'd gone wrong. As such, there was no point fussing over it. He'd just have to prove he could do better as soon as Lord Antony woke up. He knew he wasn't as effortlessly perfect as a sow, but that wasn't any excuse for incompetence. He'd been trained under the same masters as his friend, and Lord Antony had every right to expect adequacy from him. He had a job to do. He needed to be pleasing and useful to the god, and whatever he'd done wrong yesterday, he'd simply have to find a way to fix it. It wasn't anything he couldn't handle. Hanyu decided he wasn't going to fall asleep, no matter how long the day had been. He had to be awake and alert when his master rose so that he'd be ready to tend to any and all of Lord Antony's needs. It wouldn't be hard to stay awake. So much had happened and changed, and he had so much to think about that it would be impossible for him to go to sleep anyway. Antony's POV. Antony dreamed of home. It wasn't a coherent dream. He moved from place to place as soon as he thought of it, and his conversations were confusing and frustrating. The whole experience was overlaid with a vague sense of stress, as if he were taking far too long in a simple task. But even so, he sat in his mother's courtyard, basking in sunshine that didn't burn his skin, and eating fresh bread with strawberry jam that he could actually taste. As such, it was not only shocking, but infuriating when he was awakened by a cavernous snore from the direction of his sitting room. As Antony clutched his sheets and blinked in the darkness, the snore broke off, but it was quickly followed by another, just as loud. Good heavens, was that really the boy? Could he be that loud, even through the door? Surely not with human lungs. With fragile human lungs. A quick jab in half a dozen spots would slide through the ribs and puncture them easy as nothing. Antony tried to count to 10. It was difficult, because around 7 or 8 another deep rumble would interrupt him and make him clench his fists against a fresh wave of violent fantasies. Had the boy's blood really been all that good? It had, and he knew it, so he kept counting and breathing deeply until he had himself firmly under control. It wasn't as if he needed much sleep anyhow, he reflected as he heaved himself out of bed. It was just that it had been a nice dream. He crossed to his desk and slumped into the chair. It was awkward to maneuver his body into a seat that was bolted to the floor, but much less awkward than dealing with the chair that flew around his bedchamber whenever there was a spot of inclement weather. Once he was seated, he turned his attention to the maps and figures that the human king had provided him with. It seemed to be an awfully trivial situation. According to this information, the Sergish raiders didn't have the numbers to attack more than a single small village at a time, and the southern villages were barely even worth attacking, situated as they were right on the cusp of the desert. No doubt, if these raids had taken place on an odd year, the king would have dispatched a battalion or two of his own men to put paid to the rabble weeks ago. But why would he bother on a year when he would have the power of the gods at his disposal? Antony was inclined to be annoyed, but he could hardly fault the man's logic. It wouldn't do to let the desert tribes go too long between reminders of Taisha's special protection. Anyhow, this request benefited Antony as well. A bit of bloodletting would be good for his crew. It would temper their treatment of the new offerings if they had an outlet for their more extreme passions. Just a few days ago, Antony had given them all the same stern lecture he gave every 6 years, about the need to exercise moderation and make the new supply last. Since the communal stock was watched carefully, even when one of the vampires used an offering to relieve baser needs than hunger, his admonishment was directed mainly at Marcus, and everyone knew it. This was further incentive to grit his fangs and endure the cavernous rumble still emitting from his sitting room. If he snapped and broke his human too quickly, his war chief would never let him hear the end of it, and for an immortal, that was a truly daunting prospect. Anyhow, Antony rarely killed his sacrifices outright. That didn't mean he was sentimental about them like Theodora. He certainly didn't keep them around. After they served their 6 years, he released them to general service about the ship, along with the others who had completed their time in common use. Those who didn't find a new master worked in the galley, preparing food for the human residents of the ship, or worked to keep things clean, or did laundry, or were trained in sailing to man the ship during the daylight hours. Of course, their blood and bodies alike remained at the disposal of the vampires, but they tended to live out their lives largely unmolested. He'd never cared for the idea of an end-of-term feeding frenzy like the ones his brother Titus permitted on his own ship. It seemed terribly wasteful. What if the day came when they ran low on fresh offerings and needed backup meals? Antony's reflections were interrupted when the boy's racket changed form, snores giving way to loud, muzzy talking. Antony groaned. Shit! Was this going to last all day? He was tempted to wake the creature, but if he wanted to keep his plaything in good health, he knew he needed to permit him to sleep. Anyhow, as long as he was asleep, he wouldn't be grinning. Unless he was. Oh, heavens, wouldn't that be just like the irritating creature? Hanyu's stomach churned with annoyance as he envisioned the boy smiling broadly between snores. No sacrifice had claimed this much of his attention in centuries. They were supposed to be the perfect servants, flawlessly obedient and unobtrusive to the point of invisibility until they were wanted. Antony was beginning to understand why his shapely body and unusual hair color had not been enough to earn this particular boy a spot in the first row at the ceremony. He kept working for several hours, calculating how many prisoners they could accommodate. He'd have to check his strategies for docking and attacking past Theodora and Marcus respectively, but there was no harm in sketching out some ideas. He wasn't accomplishing as much as he usually would have, however, since his thoughts were continually being disrupted by the cacophony emitting from his sitting room. Every now and then the boy's snores and muttering ceased for a few blessed minutes, but it never lasted long enough to suit him. Finally, there was another sound, which made for some nice variety. It was a soft rapping on the door to his chambers, then a voice calling out, "My lord, I have your attendant's breakfast." There was a moment of silence, then another snore. Antony sighed. Apparently, the boy was a heavy sleeper, and he was going to have to answer his own door. At least this meant that he finally had an excuse to rouse the sacrifice and end the noise without resorting to violence.